All right. So today we have Dr. Nicholson, who currently work at Wake Forest Biomechanics Pitching Lab. So like Dr. Nicholson, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So I actually work for Wake Forest University School of Medicine, but I have a dual appointment in the orthopedics department and then as the Wake Forest University baseball team's biomechanist. And I run the pitching lab that we have kind of with as a shared uh, venture between those two entities.
So like we kind of talked before, prior to working with baseball, you work with figure skater, am I correct? So
Yes, correct.
can you also share a little bit your experience with figure skaters?
Yeah. So when I started grad school, my undergrad degree is in math, and I finished undergrad in 2010 when there was not a lot of job opportunities out there, and I was kind of looking for something I could do with math that wasn't just like sitting behind a computer or doing math problems that were too computationally tricky for the computer science people to solve. And so I came across biomechanics, and it really fascinated me, this mix between math and physics, but then also like the human body and using those math concepts to understand the limits and the capabilities of the human body. And I was really interested in like performance analysis. So myself, I was a runner and a triathlete, and so initially I was interested in how we could use biomechanics for like running analysis. And that does exist in some pockets in some places in the world. But when I was applying to grad schools, and I got into the University of Delaware, my advisor told me that we could do sports stuff for fun, but that all the funding and research was usually more in the clinical aspects of biomechanics. And that was turns out to be good advice, but was a little bit I don't know, didn't pan out that way because all of my grad school was paid for by this project that we did with US figure skating, which was the sports. And then now I am working with baseball and pitching. But the project that we did with the figure skaters was designed as kind of a performance enhancing or technique honing skills, not necessarily a big research project, but the elite US figure skaters would come see us, and we would do the whole motion capture of them doing the jumps that they wanted to complete. So we would only be looking at the what they did when they were in the air. So in figure skating, you have all these different kinds of jumps, and it's like a triple salchow or a triple axel, or a quad axel or a quad uh, toe loop or whatever they are. But that triple or quad determines how many times they're supposed to spin around in the air. And so we would have a skater come to us and do one of the jumps that they were trying to complete. So oftentimes they didn't quite spin around 3 times, or they didn't quite spin around 4 times, and they would either fall or just land, short of the revolutions that they were trying to achieve. And so we would take what they did using the motion capture and feed it into a program that would produce a little model of what they did in the air. And then we were able to take that model and adjust their arm positions or their trunk position or their leg positions and rerun the simulation to say what would have happened had you been in this different position. And so 99% of the time they just need to pull their arms in tighter. And when you pull your arms in tighter, you spin around faster. And so, we pulled the arms in tighter on the little model and hit go, and it spun around the number of times that they needed to spin around to complete the jump. But having that like visual tool, I think was really powerful. You could tell the skater, this is you. You just have your arms in a little bit tighter, and look, it was able to finish the jump. And I'm sure their coach told them 1,000 times, pull your arms in tighter, pull your arms in tighter. But being able to see it was a really powerful tool that I think helped them a lot.
Nice, nice. Just out of curiosity, have you ever seen a movie called Ice Princess from Disney?
I other people have mentioned that to me, but I have never actually seen it, but I think I should go see it.
Because last time we were at the lab and you mentioned that you work with figure skater before. I was like, there was a movie talk about like math and like figure skating. I was like, what was that movie? I was Google that right now and it's Ice Princess.
Someone else has mentioned that to me before, but I've never seen it, but I should watch it.
Cool, cool. So, I know we kind of also talk about this like before we start recording, but like, um, prior to working with baseball, like you kind of mentioned you don't have experience working with baseball. So, what's that like for coming to a new sport, working with a new sport?
Jeff. So obviously my funding came from that project that we did with US figure skating. And then my dissertation and a lot of the other work that we did in the lab was all focused on more clinical aspects of biomechanics, um, primarily upper extremity biomechanics. So how does the shoulder and the scapula function, in healthy populations, but also clinical populations. And then when I finished grad school, I actually worked in a more traditional pediatric gait lab. So analyzing mostly walking, some upper extremity of kids with functional movement disorders. And then I came here to Wake Forest and we built this lab around pitching. And so as you can see from my background, I didn't have, baseball specific or throwing specific experience. But I actually think that that worked in my favor because I knew how the body worked and I knew the consequences of movement as far as how that affects other movements, how that affects your torques and your forces on your body. But I didn't have a lot of these preconceived like this is how baseball's always been. This is how pitching has always been. This specific motion is what makes me unique, and I'm not going to change that. Like I didn't have any of that preconceived like this is how we need to do it going into it. I just was able to look at it from a perspective of this is how the body is moving. These are things that you're doing that are putting you at more risk for injury, or these are things that you can change that are going to increase, your output, your performance. And that was really able to shed a kind of a new light and new perspective on baseball pitching. And then I let our player development and our pitching coach kind of handle the more like, well, this is how that then applies specifically to baseball and training. And we make a really good team working together that way.
Cool. Like, is there any like situation that you encounter like maybe because you never work with baseball, so uh probably it's hard to communicate with like other staff since they what they do is baseball their whole life.
Sure. So I started here in fall of 2018, so 6 years ago. And 6 years ago, baseball biomechanics wasn't as big of a thing, if a thing kind of at all. ASMI and Alabama was doing it, and I think maybe the Rays and the Yankees, had some biomechanics stuff going on, but definitely wasn't very very publicized or well kind of accepted. And I will say at that point there was a little trouble or you had to get the right people in place. We had a really great pitching coach who was all in on the technology and wanted to understand it and figure out how we could utilize it better to help our players. We hired this player development like lab coordinator person who really uh, didn't necessarily know a lot about biomechanics, but was willing to learn, and took what I told him and really helped translate that into the baseball language. And so he really served as that kind of liaison between the tech and the biomechanics and the math and science, and then the application of how you use that then to make changes in player development. And I think without that kind of middleman who was had an interest in biomechanics and a passion for baseball, it would have been really difficult to kind of get my point across and speak baseball per se. But our team that we have has been really accepting of biomechanics and has helped push that forward. And now baseball biomechanics has exploded, and all Major League Baseball teams have a facility, and I think 6 or 7 of them are hiring biomechanists right now, and they're really trying to push it forward. And I think you'll probably start more and more to see places that are trying to maybe combine the biomechanist with that player development person, find someone that can kind of do both. But for us, at least, it worked really well to kind of have the two separate people and really have that kind of liaison between what I'm saying and what the baseball people want to hear.
Cool. Cool. So before I jump into the next topic, I want to ask so in performance world, there's like strength coaches, there's like physical therapists, there's like athletic trainer. Like biomechanics isn't that popular, at least for like basketball, the world I like live in. But and all those like textbook I buy or all those textbook I like I look at when it's in Adam's office, they're all like math. There's a lot of like equation. So like it always gives me a hard time. So can you kind of explain that what exactly is biomechanics and like how exactly does that link to like human movement?
So pure biomechanics, I usually break it down as like physics of the human body. And so I think another definition I've seen is, or an explanation is that a biomechanist will use mathematical principles and physics principles to understand and report on the capabilities and the limits of the human body. And so all those things that the biomechanist reports on, the kinematics, which are joint angles and joint velocities, and then your kinetics, which are like your joint torques and your joint forces, how much stress you're putting on different parts of your body. Those are all based in math. You need the math equations to calculate those angles and calculate those velocities and forces and torques. And then you need the understanding to interpret them and say what they mean. My undergrad degree is math, and my dissertation was looking at scapular mechanics. And so specifically, we were trying to figure out how we could use motion capture and non-invasive tools to measure scapular motion. And so we ended up using mathematical modeling to model the scapular angles based on the upper arm humerus angles, and then that one little spot on your scapula, the acromion process. So again, it was very heavy in the math realm. Um, but I had a math background, and so that was kind of the field and the direction that I took my biomechanics degree. But biomechanics in general is very interdisciplinary. There's very few schools that have like a master's or a PhD program called biomechanics. A lot of times it's either part of kinesiology or health and exercise science or biomedical engineering, or even at Delaware, at least, you could get an athletic training degree with a concentration in biomechanics. And so you can have a lot of these different experiences, and still end up being, a biomechanist, or understanding at least biomechanics. There's also a lot of great tools out there now. Visual 3D is one that we rely heavily on, where you don't necessarily need to know all of the math concepts that go into it. You don't need to know how to write the equations of motion and how to calculate Euler angles or helical angles or whatever it is that you want to look at. You more tell it like what joint segments you have and what angles you want it to calculate, and it'll calculate them for you. So it's still good to have the understanding of this is the math kind of behind it. But if math is not your strong suit, you can definitely still be a biomechanist and understand biomechanics and sports biomechanics without super strong math skills, especially if you go one of those kinesiology or health and exercise science routes for sure.
It's good to hear that. It's good to hear that because all those textbooks give me a hard time. I li literally don't understand any of those equations, any of
Yeah.
those. So, uh, next thing I want to ask is, um, I know this is a big one and it's probably really hard to explain it just by talking, but like, can you kind of break down like the human movement, what's happening on each joint when the pitcher throw a ball or pitch?
Yeah, that it is hard to kind of talk through, especially with no, visualizations. But there are a lot of great papers out there that kind of break down the kinematic sequencing and the kinetic sequencing. I would say from my experience, there's not like one idealized way to pitch. There's kind of a range of joint angles that are probably like healthiest, and then also produce the most, end ball velocity. And so, that's kind of what we recommend, trying to find this sweet spot between limiting injury and increasing performance or pitching efficiency. But there are, like I said, each one's a range. And so there's lots of different ways that you can get there. And I don't think that there's like an idealized way to pitch. But in general, it is this sequence. And so a lot of people either call it the kinematic sequence or the kinetic chain. They're both similar, but the kinematic sequence is talking about the motions, and then the kinetic chain is talking about the forces that are being starting in the ground and distributing up through the body through the ball. So your kinematic sequencing starts when you lift your leg. So you have a knee lift, and then you stride down the mound to foot strike. And so between knee lift and foot strike, your pelvis should start rotating. Your pelvis should already be mostly rotated by foot strike. It should be fully rotated by the time you get to maximum shoulder external rotation. And then around foot strike, then your trunk should start rotating. And then as your trunk is rotating, you go into layback. So the arm externally rotates. And then once you get to maximum shoulder external rotation, your pelvis should be pretty much fully rotated facing home plate. Your trunk should be rotating. Your shoulder should be in like 90 degrees of abduction, maximum external rotation. Your elbow should be more than 90 degrees flexed. And then once you hit maximum external rotation, then you start to internally rotate. Your trunk finishes its rotation. So then that energy gets transferred to the arm. The arm maximally internally rotates, and the elbow extends through ball release. And so, and then also during all of that, your trunk is kind of forward flexing as well. And so all of that together, the appropriate sequencing is what then produces the forces and transfers them. So you generate the forces from the ground and then through your pelvis. And then when your pelvis stops rotating, it gets transferred to your trunk. And then when your trunk stops rotating, it gets transferred to your arm. And then as your arm rotates and your elbow extends, it gets transferred into the ball. And so if there's a breakdown in one of those, or if your maximum trunk rotation occurs before your pelvis rotation, that disrupts the way the energy gets transferred, and you're less efficient, more likely to get hurt. Um, Things like that. I don't know if that made any sense, but it's kind of complicated to just explain. But that generally that's the idea. You need to have the appropriate kinematic sequencing, so how the body is moving, and that leads to appropriate kinetic chain and power generation.
That was perfect. That was perfect. I have a like body moving inside of my head.
Yeah.
That was perfect. That was perfect.
Okay.
So, uh, you kind of brought up this like your hip turn first, and then the energy transfer to your upper body, then your shoulder kind of like external rotate, then internal rotate. And that's kind of a thing that when we're at the lab, Adam kind of brought up is like the thoracic spine mobility, or like what people sometimes call like hip shoulder dissociation. So
Yeah.
can you share a little bit your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so some people call it like the golden factor or whatever. It's in golf as well, and what they're talking about is the maximum separation that you achieve between your pelvis and your trunk. And so, like I said, at foot strike, your pelvis should already be rotating, but your trunk should not. So essentially, your pelvis has started rotating towards home plate, but your shoulders are still, back, facing, depends if you're right or a left-handed pitcher, but facing like third base while your pelvis has rotated forward. And if your sequencing is correct, then you're able to kind of achieve that separation. You also need T-spine mobility, so just the flexibility and the mobility in your thoracic spine in order to achieve that separation. Um, but you can think of it kind of as like a spring. If you hold the spring like this and then you rotate the bottom part or your pelvis while maintaining the trunk, and then you let go of the top, then it's gonna, rotate around to catch up with the pelvis. And so the more, separation you can get, the faster and the more power that top piece is going to have when it starts to go. And so that's kind of the concept or the idea behind achieving that maximum separation. You also want to make sure you're achieving it at an appropriate time. So the maximum separation should occur at or just after foot strike. So basically, your trunk should maintain its position and not start rotating until foot strike or after foot strike. If it starts to rotate too soon, then you're also losing some of that power transfer up through the kinetic chain. And so that is a number that we look at in people's pitching reports to see how much hip shoulder separation they're able to achieve. We usually recommend that they have at least 55 degrees of hip shoulder separation. Um, and then we also give everybody that comes in a functional movement screen. And so the functional movement screen tells us how much functional mobility they actually have in their T-spine, and then also whether or not they're able to achieve hip shoulder dissociation, like you said. So, if we watch them pitch and they have less than 55 degrees of hip shoulder separation, we don't really know why at that point. Is it because they, cognitively can't separate their hips and their shoulders? Is it because they have a tight T spine and are unable to get the motion? Or is it because they're just not doing it while they're pitching? They're just not able to kind of get the sequencing and the timing correct. And so by having that functional movement screen, ahead to look at in conjunction with the pitching eval, then we're able to assess why they may or may not be, achieving the appropriate hip shoulder separation during the pitch.
Nice, nice. So the the other thing that just came out of my mind is like I I think a few months ago I was talking to a strength coach. He like all he did is golf, and he talked about like hip shoulder dissociation. There's like certain degree like if a golfer need like I don't know like different types of like what is it called, stick, and they need to hit the ball different ways. There's different angle of like the dissociation. Is that a thing with baseball that if a pitcher throw like curveball or like fastball or like I don't know, different types of like pitch, is it like the angle be different or it's actually about the same?
It's about the same. Pitch type doesn't really affect. Um, I would say pitch type doesn't really affect any of your like core kinematics. It doesn't affect your lower extremities, your core, and not really your shoulder or elbow either. It more is a change in grip and maybe a change in forearm pronation and supination that allow for the different movement and different pitch types. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with golf, but potentially, you use different clubs for different hitting scenarios, and I think they're typically based on the distance. And so it may be, in baseball, regardless of what pitch type you're throwing, you're always throwing to the same distance. And so maybe that's kind of where the difference comes in between golf and pitching.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So, uh, can you kind of like, because I'm like you mentioned like pitching eval, can you kind of like walk us through like what like the protocol of the eval? What you guys do?
Sure. So we offer pitching evaluations for anyone age 12 and over. And when they come to us, we usually start with that functional movement screen. So we do an on-base U, which is a functional movement screen specific for pitchers. So it looks at different motions and functional movements that should be associated with pitching. Our strength and conditioning coach will typically run them through that protocol. We then look at shoulder and hip range of motion, and then shoulder strength and grip strength. We then allow them to do whatever pre pre bullpen pre-game warm-up that they want to do, whatever is typical for them, and that usually includes bands, foam rollers, plyo balls, and then playing catch or long toss on the field. And then once they're finished warming up, we put their markers on, and then they do the actual 3D biomechanical assessment where we have them throw at least 4 pitches of every pitch type that they typically throw. And then if they want to throw more after that, they can. And so that's everything that we do while they're physically here with us. And then we analyze all of that data. And so I look at all of the biomechanical data from them throwing, and I'll make comments on things that they could change to decrease their risk of getting hurt, specifically decrease the torque on the elbow, which is associated with those UCL injuries, and decrease the force on the shoulder, which is associated with the rotator cuff and impingement type injuries. And then also give recommendations on things they can do to increase their performance or increase their ball velocity. And then the strength and conditioning coach will score and make recommendations on their functional movement screen. And our head athletic trainer will comment and make recommendations based on the range of motion and the strength assessment. And so the player will receive kind of all 3 of those reports with feedback. And then they're able to go through a follow-up Zoom call with our lab coordinator and player development coordinator, and he'll kind of walk them through the results and tell them in baseball language kind of what they mean and how to make some of those adjustments and recommendations.
Cool, cool. So, uh, I know in pitcher they deal with a lot of like UCL injury.
Yeah.
They have like Tommy John surgery, like Shohei Ohtani last year had, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And besides like UCL, is there other type of injury like pitcher commonly like have or you guys encounter?
Yeah, the UCL injuries are definitely the most common and kind of the most burdensome. It requires surgery and a year kind of recovery, and so they'll miss at least one, if not 2, kind of seasons if they end up needing Tommy John surgery and UCL reconstruction. And that is happening more and more often and at younger and younger ages. It's not a like end of your career type injury anymore, but it does, set them back, and it is, expensive, and no one wants to get hurt. And so that's kind of the main one that we focus on trying to avoid and trying to figure out what is really causing all of these injuries and why they're occurring, in younger kids. But baseball pitchers also experience lots of other injuries. There's other elbow injuries. There's like little league elbow, which is usually just like overuse and it kind of gets fatigued and sore. And then there's lots of shoulder issues as well, rotator cuff tears, impingement, thoracic outlet issues, and things like that. Um, they tend to not be have the same burden as the UCL ruptures, but they do occur and they are also put people on the DL list. So it's something that we also look at to try to recommend how to avoid those as well.
Cool. Because I know in like basketball world right now, we have force plate, 3D motion capture. What else? Whatever technology we have right now, like strength coaches, physical therapists, we all try to we all want to prevent injury or at least decrease the chance or decrease injury rate.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I know, with all those technology we have, it actually didn't help us decrease the injury rate. So, can you share in your experience in baseball world, like with pitching lab with the E valve, did the pitching rate kind of decrease or your yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the main differences between like baseball and basketball as far as like injury prevention kind of goes is one, the UCL injuries in baseball could be considered, an epidemic. Like they're just so many and so prevalent. You don't see kind of the same thing in basketball. But also the pitcher is doing this, repetitive, controlled motion. There's no external forces. They're just throwing the ball, to the catcher over and over and over again. In basketball, the only thing that's kind of comparable is free throws. But other than that, there's other people, the ball's coming from different places. They're running around and moving while they're throwing. And so it's really hard to like utilize force plates and motion capture to say, well, let's make some mechanical changes that are going to reduce the risk of getting hurt. It's in basketball, it's probably more of a factor of like we need to be able to identify when they're getting fatigued because that's when they start to get hurt is when they're fatigued and less aware of what's going on around them and less able to kind of control their muscles when they're landing, and that's where they're getting the UCL injuries and things like that, or ACL injuries in basketball. But in baseball and in pitching, we can change a mechanic, and the only thing that changes is the intrinsic what's happening to the pitcher, and so we can say, well, if you change these mechanics, it'll change the force on your elbow and potentially reduce the wear and tear as you're repeating this motion over and over and over and over again. Um, and so I will say that what we're doing has helped, but we're not 100% there yet. In 2020 three, I think we had no major pitching injuries, no UCL injuries in our club, which is pretty amazing. But then in 2024, we had two UCL injuries and then a broken humerus from a previous UCL injury. And so we have all those players that got hurt. We have their pitching data and we have their biomechanics reports, and there wasn't like a red flag or something that stood out as, oh, they need to change this or they're going to get hurt. And so there's something more than just pure mechanics, going into these injuries that we're still trying to figure out. And so whether that's fatigue or overall load monitoring or something else, we're still trying to figure that out. But we have all the tools in the tech to kind of start building off the pure just mechanics side of it to figure out what these injuries are and how to help decrease them.
Cool, cool. I think that's like all the question I have for you today. And
Okay.
I'm gonna tell you a story. So before we went to the pitching lab, like Adam was like really excited. He was like a fan. I was like, oh, we're just going to a pitching lab. I mean, like we go to all these like D1 Power 4, Power 5 school with
Yeah.
like these like really famous like head coaches, really like big time strength coaches. I mean, like he acted like a fan. I was like, that was so funny. But now, like after like doing this podcast with you, I kind of understand that like you're like really super smart, like super smart.
Well, thank you.
That was like amazing. I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So for all those who are interested in what we're talking about today, who or maybe who's interested in doing a pitching eval or like the research you did, where can they reach out to you?
We have a website. It's wakeforestpitchinglab.com. And so on there is where you sign up for evals, and there's a little bit more description of the process and things like that. I think there's also like a research tab, but I'm not sure how up to date it is. There is a contact us form on there that people are welcome to fill out. Or if they want to reach me directly to talk about research or things like that, my email address is KF as in Frank, NICHOL at wakehealth.edu.
Nice, nice. Thank you.